With the 12-team playoff coming this season, Missouri fans and lots of programs across the country are focused on making it. But I'm worried this could come at the expense of devaluing championships like the SEC title. I want to explain why coming up right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. On today's program, I can't believe it, we finally got our first Kim English mention in the comments section. In a bad Missouri basketball season, a disastrous basketball season, I would have thought it would have come sooner than that. And also, it seems like maybe for the first time ever, a lot of people are legitimately more excited about the women's tournament than the men's tournament this March. But you know what? Before we start with the program, I do want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Now, if you've been a fan of college sports over the last 35 plus years, like I've been, well, it's hard not to notice one obvious trend, especially in college basketball. It's that the conference title tournaments, well, those have been completely devalued over time. In fact, the ACC tournament, for example, for years, the ACC champion was really considered the winner of that conference tournament. Really no different than the NCAA tournament. The winner of that tournament obviously is considered the NCAA champion. So even more weight was put on that than regular season titles. Now, I'm young enough to where I've never gone quite that far with it, though obviously Norm Stewart famously would put every bit as much weight on those conference tournaments, sometimes to some people's opinions at the expense of the NCAA tournament. In my opinion, I think that's a bit of playing the results kind of narrative there. But regardless, the point is, there is no question that over time, these days, people barely even pay attention to the conference tournaments, much less so than they did even, say, 10, 15, and 20 years ago. Well, in college football, fortunately, the conference titles still mean a tremendous, tremendous amount, especially when you're a program like Missouri that hasn't won one since 1969. So I remember probably decades ago, my dad telling me, you know what, John, I just want one in basketball and football, meaning a national championship. Well, again, that was quite a while ago, and now as I get older, as my dad gets older, the odds of that are seeming less and less by the day. Let's be brutally honest about the whole thing. So I'll be honest with you all, an SEC championship in football would really mean every bit as much to me, maybe almost as much is the thing, because if Missouri actually won the SEC title in football this year and maybe came up short in the quarterfinals in the college football playoff, sure, I'd be disappointed when they lost that last game. But to me, that's certainly a banners, flags fly forever moment there, because I think I would genuinely be overcome with joy if Missouri actually won an SEC title. I think I would probably put that in terms of fan experiences even ahead of the Royals championship that I got to see in 2015. And of course, the past three Chiefs Super Bowl championships which were obviously tremendous as well. But to me, an SEC title, as a huge Missouri fan that I am, heck, just give me one of those in each sport and I will die a happy man. I truly mean that. But obviously a national title would be even something more on top of that. My point is as college football seems to keep expanding the tournament, if you will, the college football tournament, the college football playoff. Hey, we're going to 12 this coming season. It seems like going to 14 or even 16 teams, which is a more round number, obviously, for a tournament bracket purposes, being 16. Well, I think that seems like it's inevitable. And the more that expands, ironically, it seems like the rest of the sport is going to detract and get even smaller, and power is being even more concentrated in the power conferences, especially in the SEC and the Big Ten. The most obvious example being that the Pac-12 basically is now kaput. They're now the two-pack instead of being the Pac-12. So what I'm worried about is if the SEC and Big Ten, say in a few years, as some have speculated, maybe as soon as even 2026, maybe they've expanded to the point where there are 4 divisions in each of those conferences. Well, then, I don't know. To me, now you're having like a semifinal perhaps type deal. I just wonder if maybe you're putting a little bit too much product into the thing, because now you've seen with the college football playoff, well, you've expanded it. It used to be obviously the BCS National Championship game for a while. Well, when people thought that was insufficient, obviously we expanded to 4 teams. And what happened almost immediately, certainly within a couple seasons or so, is all the rest of the bowl games have been devalued. You see guys opting out of them, significant players like Marvin Harrison Jr., for example, opting out of the Cotton Bowl against Missouri this past season. Used to be one of the big bowl games, still is one of the absolute big bowl games, no doubt about that. So if that bowl game is being devalued, if the ACC tournament and the SEC tournament, even the Big 12 tournament, which is still a great event in Kansas City, of course, but it's just not what it used to be. It's not what it was in the days of Roy Williams and Norm Stewart and Billy Tubbs and all of those cats. So to me, what I'm worried about is the expansion of the college football playoff, the concentration of power in these major conferences. I'm just worried that suddenly we could see a day when the conference titles are not worth what they used to be. They're not valued as much. And to me, if you ever saw a situation where a team had basically clinched a spot in the college football playoff, maybe a bye, but still had to play the SEC championship game, for instance, but then had a significant player sit out that game to sort of protect themselves from injury, boy, we've really, really gone too far then. And I think there's a serious danger of that scenario that I just laid out for you. You can see it. A number 1 seed, a number 1 Georgia, that type of thing next season. Let's say Carson Beck or Dominic Lovett or some significant player for Georgia has a fairly significant injury that maybe you could play through. And normally, if it was the last game of the season, it was for the national title. If it was for just even the quarterfinals of the college football playoff, if that person would play through it, but then would sit out the SEC title game, oh man, something has really been lost here. And I think too much has been lost at times in college football over the last few years. I think the danger of both sports is, I've said it before and I'll say it again, if you become too much like the NFL, you become too much like the NBA, then what's differentiating you? Now you're just a lesser version of the NFL or the NBA, and unfortunately, that's something I think has really hurt college basketball over the years. And coming up, let's dive into the old comment section. And yes, our first Kim English mention of the season. Let's talk about how he's doing at Providence this year. Might he be willing to come back to Missouri in the future? Boy, that's jumping the gun, isn't it? But we'll talk about Kimmy coming up here in just a second. And also Luther Burden, the punt returner. I think those days should be over. I really do. One of my longtime listeners and I, one of the everydayers and I think we've solved this problem. But you know what? Before I get there, let's talk about Game Time, because if you're looking for last-minute tickets, Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. And right now, I can basically get you in to the Missouri game for free on Saturday, folks. I really can. All you have to do is use the promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. And you can get, if I open up my app right now, I promise you I can get a single for less than $20. Hey, if you're really going to procrastinate, wait until the last second. I bet you can get a pair for less than $20. Get into the game for free or at a very reduced price on me, John Miller at Locked On Mizzou. Don't tell me I never did anything for you. But honestly, regardless of what you're into, we're talking the St. Louis Blues, comedy shows, theater events. It's all there. Just remember that terms apply. You got to download the Game Time app and use the promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. That's code LOCKEDON. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So every once in a while, I put on the old hazmat suit and brave the bowels and the depths of the YouTube comments section. So let's do it right now, shall we? So listener Shane Nelson says, the fact of the matter is Arizona is Desiree Reed Francois' alma mater. People always want to go back home to where they had roots. In 2 to 3 years, if Kim English ends up being an elite basketball coach, you don't think he'd want to come back to Mizzou and do for Mizzou what others have done for their roots? Well, as for roots, let's maybe clarify something here. Arizona is actually not really Desiree Reed Francois' alma mater per se. Yes, she went to law school there, got her law degree from Arizona, but in fact, she went to her undergrad at UCLA. She was on the crew team there. And by the way, the crew team, UCLA crew, oh, thank God, it wasn't USC crew. Okay, so we don't have a Lori Loughlin situation here, it would not seem. Thank goodness. But in all seriousness, though, Kim English, he's actually closer to his roots at Providence in Rhode Island from his old stomping grounds of Baltimore than he is to the University of Missouri. Now, again, Mizzou is a big part of Kim English's time, for sure. He was really attached to Mizzou. Is he still as attached to Mizzou? There may be a couple questions there, to be honest. I think possibly, there's no doubt that English wanted this job when Dennis Gates got it previously, when he was up for it. I'm not saying Missouri should have given him that job whatsoever. I thought it was a little too early. I'm a believer in Kim English in the long term for sure. There's a reason he's got a job in a major conference already. And by the way, English doing a nice job in his first season at Providence. He has Providence, I would say, well, I'll just say, according to Joe Lunardi, he has them one of the last 4 in the tournament. So they're certainly right on the bubble to make March Madness. But you have to say Ed Cooley, their coach of the previous 11 seasons, had them in the big dance more often than not. So really, this is about an average season for Providence over the last decade plus. So Kim English, I'd say, is doing a nice job in his first season. I complained about how Missouri has not been a good defensive program in my previous show. Well, guess what? In his first season as Providence's coach, English does have them as the 18th best defensive team in the country. That's up from 92nd the previous year, Ed Cooley's last. But, well, they've done an opposite flip on the other end of the court. Offensively, Providence has fallen from 18th last season to 120th. So a bit of a mixed bag there. Hard to really judge English at this point. And again, as far as him coming back to his roots, you know, Kim English has not played basketball or been part of the Columbia community in quite some time, about a decade or so. I'm just not sure how important that is to him. I'm not saying it's not. I'm literally saying I don't know. Let's not make a whole bunch of assumptions there. It certainly will be interesting to see how Kim English's career plays out. And obviously, if he's a success, under the right circumstances, sure, you'd welcome him back to Missouri with open arms. But at the same time, I'm not ready to give up on Dennis Gates whatsoever. Let's see how this baby plays out. And once again, even if Missouri is terrible again next season, do you really want to spend $17 million just to make the basketball coach go away? I'm not really sure the economics of that make a whole lot of sense. But here's an idea that to me makes all the sense in the world, and it's from John Berger, one of my everyday listeners. He says Marquise Johnson has amazing hands and tracks the football perfectly, super fast and elusive. He should be returning punts and kickoffs. He's dynamic. You know what, Johnny? I totally agree with you. I really do. I think he's the perfect candidate to be the number one punt returner. He already was basically one of the two guys back there. He was basically the number one kickoff guy last year, so nothing needs to change there. But in terms of punt returning, talked quite a bit of this offseason about Luther Burden, and in the past about him as a punt returner. And I'll just to be perfectly clear, I think Burden's season last season, his true sophomore year, was as good as anybody could have possibly expected. He was incredible last season. But I will admit, I thought based on just his high school film, I would have thought he would have made more of an impact as a punt returner so far. He's been a good punt returner, perfectly fine. I just don't think he's been so dynamic and so good that we need to put him back there and risk his injuries, number one, and number two, just putting more tread on his tires in terms of conditioning and just actual energy that he needs to expend on the field. Somebody pointed out in my comments as well, I'm not questioning them. I'm just saying I'm just going off this person's memory and not my own. They pointed out that when Luther Burden, hey, that ball likes to hit the ground a lot, pick it off the ground sometimes. I haven't noticed a ton of muffs from him, but he did point out, yes, this commenter in the Gasparilla Bowl, there was a muffed punt in that football game. Him maybe trying to do a little bit too much there. Again, I just think in terms of touches, in terms of the amount of things and reps that we expect from Luther Burden and snaps that he needs to take next season, I just think taking a really big responsibility. As I said yesterday, I think punt returner is low-key one of the most important positions on the entire field, especially in a close football game. To me, just take that responsibility off Luther Burden and give it to Marquise Johnson, a guy who I would like to see on the field more. Again, a guy, like John Berger said, very dynamic, and to me, I thought his point was great there. Maybe he just listens to me. I don't know. But seriously, I've made this point many times as well. You can see it on that fake punt against Kentucky, the Luke Bauer pass, and frankly, every deep ball in the Cotton Bowl, in all these other games for Marquise Johnson. He just has a knack for tracking that ball in the air, which lends itself well, those high footballs in the air. I think that lends itself well to being a really good punt returner as well. Not only a dynamic one, but a safe one, a guy who's probably going to catch the football and hold on to it. I'd at least like to see that in spring practice, fall ball. Let's see if he can handle it, because if he can, if we're right here, if John and John are correct, well, I think that's the direction Missouri should head. Now, I will admit this, if Burden were still Missouri's punt returner for this upcoming season, if he were able to run one or two back for a touchdown, that would obviously help his Heisman campaign a lot. And if you look over at FanDuel Sportsbook, Burden is 100-1 to win the Heisman. Brady Cook 30-1. That makes some sense. Obviously, the quarterback's more likely. But in this case, Burden at 100-1, I think I would prefer that value. And it really does help that this upcoming season, basically everybody is going to know nationally who Brady Cook and Luther Burden are. This past season, of course, Cody Schrader got up to 6th in the Heisman campaign. And that was, by the way, after hardly anybody really knew who he was at the beginning of the season. He was very much off the radar despite playing quite a bit, obviously, in 2022 and some high-profile games as well. But you know what? Regardless of what you think of my betting opinions, if you're going to take action, you got to get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. It's FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Now, about a week ago, when I had a discussion about the non-revenue sports for Missouri, related to Desiree Reed-Francois, who is definitely, under her administration, she was pushing for Missouri to emphasize those sports more, meaning not men's basketball and football, the rest of those sports. And my whole thing was, I don't have a problem with it, but I got to be honest, I have a tough time making a case for added value here, whether it's monetarily or otherwise. But I definitely got some pushback from people who are fans of these sports, women's basketball, baseball in particular, which were the two sports that I focused on. And I do have to agree that there is a point there, and there's some people who have a point there in terms of, hey, is all of this just a self-fulfilling prophecy? You know, the problem is, I think, I'll be honest with you, I think some of the problem with women's college basketball, although certainly women's college basketball is having a moment right now, I think there are a lot of people who are looking forward to the women's college basketball tournament more than the men's tournament right now. Just in terms of pure star power, it's hard to argue that Caitlin Clark isn't the biggest star in the country. Frankly, who's number two? Is it Zach Edey, I guess, on the men's side? Heck, honestly, it might be UConn's Paige Buchers on the women's side, or Angel Reese from LSU. I think those ladies are probably more famous than just about anybody in the men's game right now. So I do agree that women's basketball is definitely having a moment here. And, you know, Title IX, for example, there's a lot of discussion of that. Of course, I think in a world without Title IX, I think women's basketball would absolutely 100% exist, because women's basketball matters at places like Connecticut and Tennessee and South Carolina, obviously Iowa these days for sure with Caitlin Clark, and many other programs. But do we really need 350 Division I women's basketball teams? That I would question a little bit. So again, women's college basketball, for example, would absolutely still exist without Title IX, but it might not at Missouri, because really women's hoops just has never really mattered that much at Missouri, if I'm being brutally honest. Now, it mattered when Sophie Cunningham was here. When Missouri had true star power, it mattered a lot more. It really did. And perhaps you get the right coach in here, you can recreate that star power. But again, it just so happened that star ended up going to high school like 4 miles down the road, literally down the road, Providence Road at Rockbridge High School. So I don't know if that's going to happen again. I don't know that your sister-in-law, for instance, is going to have some daughters that are good basketball players as well. So again, those are the circumstances for Missouri basketball. On the women's side, I would like it to be better. If it's going to exist, obviously, I'd like it to be better. But you know what? If it weren't for the Title IX world, I don't know that Missouri women's basketball needs to exist. I'm not trying to kill it or anything. I'm just saying that it doesn't need to be everywhere. That's all I'm trying to say. This really isn't specific to Missouri women's basketball whatsoever, because honestly, those Sophie Cunningham, Porter era basketball teams, I really enjoyed them. I hopped on the bandwagon. It was fun stuff Jordan Roundtree and Hannah Schutz and all these different ladies, Amber Smith. I got, as you can tell, I'm just naming them off the top of my head. Well, I have trouble naming them off the top of my head over the last couple years because there just hasn't been as much of a reason to watch. So again, to your point, there is definitely a self-fulfilling prophecy there. If you have a winner, people will be more interested in it. And for sure, I think if you're on the non-rev side, you want to attract people to soccer and women's basketball and whatever it might be, baseball, softball, of course. You got to make it as fan and family friendly. As somebody who has a couple young kids, I'll just tell you that one of the biggest barriers to taking them to those revenue sports is it's just a crowd, it's a commitment and all that stuff. Hey, it's a lot more appealing to be able to go to some of these less crowded games for sure. So make it more family friendly. You really might have something there. So with all that being said, until next time, I am John Miller and this has been Locked on Mizzou.